"You're alone now," my daughter-in-law whispered in my ear at my son's funeral, as if she were offering comfort instead of a verdict. The organ was still playing when she said it, low and solemn, filling the small white church Daniel had attended since he was a boy. I stood beside his casket, my black gloves folded neatly in front of me, staring at the polished wood that separated me from my only child, and I felt her breath against my cheek as she leaned closer, her voice so soft no one else could hear. Around us, friends from town dabbed at their eyes with tissues, neighbors brought casseroles and murmured how sorry they were for my loss, and the pastor spoke gently about faith and endurance. I nodded at the right moments. I thanked people for coming. I kept my back straight. Lauren's hand rested on my arm in what must have looked like shared grief, but her fingers pressed just a little too firmly, as though she were reminding me of something. "You're alone now," she repeated, barely moving her lips, and when I turned to look at her, she offered the same composed, widowed expression she had worn all morning. I didn't pull away. I didn't react. I simply held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, and then looked back at Daniel's casket. The scent of lilies filled the air, heavy and sweet. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting soft colors across the pews where people who had watched my son grow up now sat in stunned silence. They saw a grieving mother and a grieving wife standing side by side. They did not see the quiet calculation in Lauren's eyes. They did not know what I knew. 3 weeks before Daniel passed, I had discovered something that changed the way I saw my daughter-in-law forever. I had not confronted her. I had not even mentioned it to Daniel. I had simply tucked the knowledge away, the way a woman my age learns to tuck away many things: receipts, letters, memories that don't yet make sense. As the choir began to sing Amazing Grace, I felt the weight of 72 years settle across my shoulders, but not in the way Lauren expected. She believed I had lost everything that mattered. She believed that without my son, I would fade into the background, a lonely widow, in a quiet ranch house on the edge of town. She thought I would cling to her for connection, for access to my grandchildren, for any scrap of family she chose to allow me. That was why she leaned in so confidently. That was why she felt bold enough to whisper a sentence meant to shrink me. I let a single tear fall because it was real. I had buried my child that morning. But my silence was not weakness. It was restraint. When the service ended and the line formed to offer condolences, Lauren slipped effortlessly into the role of devoted wife, accepting hugs, thanking coworkers for coming, speaking about Daniel's dedication and kindness. I watched her closely, the way I have watched storms roll in across open fields, knowing that what looks distant can arrive without warning. Every now and then, her eyes flicked toward me, measuring, assessing. She expected devastation. She expected confusion. What she did not expect was patience. As we stepped outside into the crisp Ohio afternoon, the wind lifting the edge of my black coat, she leaned close one last time and said, almost kindly, "We'll talk about the house soon." I gave her a small, polite nod. She had no idea that before any conversation about houses or bank accounts or next steps could begin, there was a truth waiting quietly beneath the surface, and I was the only one in that churchyard who knew exactly how deep it ran. The cemetery sat on a gentle hill just outside town, the kind of place where the grass is trimmed in straight lines and small American flags appear on veterans' graves every Memorial Day. I remained by Daniel's headstone long after most of the mourners had drifted back to their cars. Lauren stood near the black sedan with 2 of her friends, her posture elegant, her sunglasses large enough to hide her eyes. From a distance, she looked like a grieving widow gathering strength. Up close, I knew better. I watched the way she checked her phone between condolences, the way her shoulders relaxed the moment she believed no one was paying attention. When she finally walked back toward me, her heels sinking slightly into the damp ground, she spoke in the same measured tone she had used inside the church. She said we would need to discuss practical matters soon. Bills. Insurance. The house. She spoke the word house carefully, as if testing how it sounded in the open air. I told her there would be time for everything. My voice did not tremble. It surprised her. I could see that. She had expected me to cling to her, to ask what would happen next, to seek reassurance. Instead, I adjusted the collar of my coat and brushed a bit of soil from the sleeve. Daniel had bought that coat for me 5 winters ago, driving 2 hours to the outlet mall, because he said I deserved something warm and well-made. I remembered how he laughed when I protested the price. He said, "Mom, you spent your whole life taking care of me. Let me do this." Lauren did not like that trip. She said it was unnecessary, that we should be more careful with money. At the time I believed she was simply practical. I did not yet understand how closely she watched every dollar that moved in and out of Daniel's accounts. 3 weeks before he died, I had been sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea when my phone buzzed with an email notification. I do not usually check my email after dinner, but something prompted me that night. It was a message forwarded by mistake, sent from Daniel's financial advisor to Lauren, and then to me by accident when she attempted to reply. The subject line mentioned a policy adjustment and a transfer authorization. I did not fully grasp the details at first. I only recognized numbers that did not match what Daniel had once told me about his savings. The next morning, I called the advisor under the pretense of updating my beneficiary information for my own modest account. I asked simple questions. I listened carefully. By the end of that call, a quiet unease had settled in my chest. Funds had been moved. Signatures had been added. Documents had been revised. None of it illegal on the surface, but none of it discussed with me either, despite Daniel's long-standing habit of keeping me informed about major decisions. Standing beside his grave now, I folded those memories neatly into place. Lauren spoke about deadlines and paperwork, about how overwhelming everything would be for her alone. I let her speak. The wind lifted a strand of her perfectly styled hair, and she tucked it behind her ear with a gesture that would have seemed fragile to anyone else. I saw calculation instead. When she finally finished outlining the urgency of our future conversations, I told her that we would review everything carefully, together, with the appropriate professionals. I emphasized the last 2 words. Appropriate professionals. Her jaw tightened for just a second before she nodded. She assumed I meant the same attorney she had been consulting quietly for months. She did not know that I had already scheduled a meeting with someone else, someone Daniel trusted long before Lauren entered his life. As we walked back toward the parking lot, gravel crunching beneath our shoes, she reached for my arm again, performing solidarity for the few remaining onlookers. I allowed it. I have learned that sometimes the strongest position is the one that looks the weakest. She believed she had just buried her husband and secured her future. She believed I had buried my son and any leverage I once held. What she did not understand was that grief can sharpen the mind. And mine, despite my age, was very sharp indeed. That evening I returned to my house alone, the same small brick ranch where Daniel had grown up, where pencil marks still measured his height on the pantry wall. The silence felt heavier than it had the night before, as if the finality of the burial had settled into the furniture itself. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, listening to the refrigerator hum and the ticking of the clock above the stove. Grief moves in waves, but beneath mine was something steadier, something deliberate. I poured myself a glass of water, sat down at the oak table Daniel had refinished for me one summer, and opened the folder I had placed in the bottom drawer 3 weeks earlier. Inside were printed emails, bank summaries, and notes written in my careful cursive. The forwarded message from the financial advisor had been brief, but revealing. It referenced a policy update on Daniel's life insurance and a reallocation of certain investment funds. What troubled me was not that changes had been made. It was that Daniel had always consulted me before major decisions, not because he needed permission, but because that was the rhythm of our relationship. After his father passed away 15 years ago, Daniel became my sounding board, and I became his. We spoke about everything from mortgage rates to health coverage. Yet these changes had happened quietly. I remembered the day I visited Daniel and Lauren's house after noticing the email. Lauren had greeted me with a bright smile and a tight embrace. Daniel had been resting upstairs, tired from what we all believed was a manageable illness. While Lauren brewed coffee, her phone buzzed repeatedly on the counter. She glanced at the screen each time with a flicker of irritation before silencing it. I did not ask questions then. I simply observed. Later that week, I called the advisor, Mr. Henderson, and introduced myself as Daniel's mother. I explained that I had received an email in error and wanted to confirm that there had been no mistake. He hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. He said that Daniel had recently signed documents adjusting beneficiaries and consolidating certain accounts for simplicity. Simplicity. That word lingered in my mind. Daniel had never valued simplicity over transparency. I asked whether Daniel had come into the office alone. Mr. Henderson paused again and said that Lauren had been present for most of the meetings. He emphasized that everything appeared properly authorized. I thanked him and ended the call. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying small conversations from the past few months. Lauren had asked detailed questions about payout timelines. She had suggested refinancing their home despite stable interest rates. She had encouraged Daniel to streamline his assets, as she put it, in case anything unexpected happened. At the time, I believed she was being responsible. Now I saw a pattern. Sitting at my kitchen table after the funeral, I ran my fingers over the edge of the folder and considered the next step. Lauren believed the coming weeks would overwhelm me. She believed I would rely on her interpretation of every document, every figure, every signature. She did not know that I had already scheduled an appointment with Thomas Green, the estate attorney who had helped Daniel draft his original will before he married. Thomas had known my son since he was 25 years old. He respected him. He respected me. I checked the time on the microwave. 8:15 in the evening. Too late to call anyone, but not too late to prepare. I organized the papers in chronological order, wrote down questions in clear print, and placed the folder back into the drawer. Grief still pressed against my ribs, but alongside it was clarity. Lauren had whispered that I was alone. She was mistaken. I had experience. I had memory. And I had the truth, carefully documented, waiting for the right moment to surface. 2 days after the funeral, Lauren called me at 9:30 in the morning, her voice steady and organized, as if she were scheduling a dentist appointment instead of discussing the remains of my son's life. She said she had gathered all the financial documents and thought it would be efficient for us to review them together at her house that afternoon. Efficient was another one of her favorite words. I agreed without hesitation. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue cardigan and the pearl earrings Daniel had given me on my 70th birthday. I have learned that presentation matters, especially when someone expects you to appear fragile. The drive to their subdivision took 15 minutes. Identical beige houses lined the streets, each with trimmed lawns and neatly edged sidewalks. Daniel had been proud to buy that home, proud to give his family stability. When Lauren opened the door, she greeted me with a polite smile and stepped aside to let me in. The living room looked untouched by grief. Decorative pillows were arranged perfectly. A scented candle burned on the coffee table, something light and floral. On the dining table sat a tidy stack of folders and a legal pad filled with notes in Lauren's sharp handwriting. She gestured for me to sit. As she began outlining account balances and policy numbers, I noticed how fluently she spoke about timelines. She mentioned waiting periods, payout structures, and projected figures as though she had rehearsed them. She explained that consolidating Daniel's investments had been necessary to simplify matters in case of a worst-case scenario. She said it gently, almost sympathetically, but her eyes watched me closely, measuring my reaction. I asked simple questions. When were the beneficiary adjustments signed? Who initiated the appointment with the advisor? Why were certain funds transferred in increments rather than a single amount? She answered each question smoothly, but there were small pauses, barely noticeable, like hairline cracks in glass. At one point she said Daniel had insisted on handling everything quickly because he did not want me to worry. That was the first moment I felt a quiet certainty settle into place. Daniel would never have excluded me under the guise of protecting me from worry. He knew I preferred the truth, even when it was difficult. As she spoke, my eyes drifted to a framed photograph on the mantel. It showed Daniel at age 10, missing his front teeth, holding up a blue ribbon from the county science fair. I remembered helping him glue cardboard panels together at our kitchen table, how he had insisted on reading every line of his presentation aloud to me until he felt confident. He had always valued preparation and honesty. I returned my attention to Lauren and let her finish her explanation. When she slid a document toward me and suggested that I sign to acknowledge receipt of the information, I placed my hands calmly in my lap. I told her I would prefer to have Thomas Green review everything before signing anything. The temperature in the room seemed to shift. She blinked once, then forced a nod. She asked why that would be necessary. I replied that Daniel had trusted Thomas for years and that it would bring me peace of mind. Peace of mind. Another phrase that sounds gentle but carries weight. Lauren leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly against the table before she stopped herself. She said, "Of course, whatever makes you comfortable." But the warmth had drained from her tone. I gathered the copies she offered and stood to leave. As I reached the door, she asked whether I planned to stay in my house long term. The question floated between us, casual on the surface. I told her I had not decided. That was true. What I had decided was that no decision would be made without clarity. As I walked back to my car under the bright Ohio sun, I felt grief beside me like a shadow, but I also felt something steadier, something that had carried me through widowhood and years of careful budgeting and raising a son alone. Lauren believed she was guiding the process. She did not realize she had just revealed how much she had to lose. The next morning, I drove downtown to meet Thomas Green at his office on Main Street, a red brick building that had stood there longer than most of the newer storefronts around it. The brass plaque beside the door still read Green and Associates, Estate and Trust Law, the same as it had 20 years ago when Daniel first walked through those doors to draft his original will. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always do, and sat in the reception area beneath a framed photograph of the town courthouse taken in 1968. When Thomas came out to greet me, his expression softened with genuine sympathy. He had attended the service but had kept a respectful distance. Now he shook my hand firmly and led me into his office. I placed the folder on his desk and told him I needed clarity, not comfort. He nodded and began reviewing the documents one by one, adjusting his glasses as he read. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic outside and the soft turning of pages. After several minutes, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. He explained that the beneficiary changes and fund transfers were legally executed but unusually timed. He asked whether Daniel had expressed any desire to alter his long-standing estate structure. I told him no. Daniel had always intended for certain assets to remain protected, particularly the house and the investment account he had started before marriage. Thomas tapped the edge of one document and pointed out a clause that had been modified just 6 weeks before Daniel passed away. The new language shifted a significant portion of liquid assets directly into Lauren's sole control, bypassing certain contingencies Daniel had previously insisted upon. It was subtle, almost technical, but meaningful. Thomas said the adjustments were not inherently improper, yet they warranted closer examination given Daniel's medical condition at the time. He asked whether Daniel had seemed pressured or unusually anxious in his final months. I thought back to his tired smile, the way he would change the subject when finances came up, the way Lauren often answered for him during conversations. I told Thomas that Daniel had seemed eager to keep the peace, even when it cost him something. Thomas nodded slowly. He then opened another document, the life insurance policy summary. He pointed to the payout structure and the recent increase in coverage that had been approved less than 3 months before Daniel's condition worsened. The premiums had been adjusted upward, and the beneficiary designation had been simplified to a single primary recipient. Thomas did not need to say her name. We both understood. He explained that if there were concerns about undue influence or lack of full disclosure, there might be grounds to request a formal review, but such actions required careful evidence and precise timing. I felt a steady calm settle over me as he spoke. I was not interested in spectacle. I was interested in truth. I asked Thomas whether any previous versions of the will remained on file. He smiled faintly and reached into a cabinet behind him. From it, he retrieved a sealed envelope labeled with Daniel's name and a date from 3 years earlier. He said that Daniel had insisted on retaining a copy of the original draft in case future revisions ever felt rushed. That detail alone told me more than any spreadsheet could. Daniel had anticipated the possibility of pressure. He had prepared for it quietly. Thomas suggested scheduling a formal reading of the most recent will in his office within the week, with all relevant parties present. He explained that sometimes clarity arrives not through confrontation, but through documentation. I agreed. As I left his office and stepped back into the bright Ohio afternoon, I felt the same mix of grief and resolve that had accompanied me since the funeral. Lauren believed she was orchestrating the next chapter. She did not yet understand that Daniel had left behind more than assets. He had left safeguards, and I intended to honor them. 3 days later, Lauren called to confirm the meeting at Thomas Green's office, her tone carefully neutral, as though she were discussing a routine errand. I told her the appointment was set for 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. She paused for half a second before saying that she had assumed her own attorney would handle any formalities. I replied gently that Daniel had long-standing arrangements with Thomas and that honoring those arrangements felt appropriate. There was a quiet exhale on the other end of the line, the kind people release when they realize a plan is shifting beyond their control. She agreed to attend. On Thursday, I arrived at the office 15 minutes early. I wore the same navy cardigan and pearls, not out of habit, but out of intention. Thomas greeted me with a steady nod and invited me to sit at the long conference table in the center of the room. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin stripes across the polished wood. When Lauren entered, she looked composed, dressed in a tailored gray suit, her expression calm but alert. She offered a brief greeting and took the seat across from me. Thomas began by expressing condolences, then moved directly into the purpose of the meeting. He explained that he would be reviewing Daniel's most recent will and clarifying its provisions. His voice was even, professional, without drama. He first summarized the original structure Daniel had established several years ago, outlining the distribution of assets, the protective clauses, and the contingency plans. Lauren listened closely, her hands folded on the table. Then Thomas opened a separate folder containing the updated documents. He described the modifications made 6 weeks before Daniel passed, noting the reallocation of certain liquid assets and the adjustment of beneficiary designations. As he spoke, I watched Lauren's posture. She remained still, but her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of her notepad. Thomas then referenced the sealed earlier draft Daniel had insisted remain on file. He explained that in situations where revisions occurred during periods of significant health challenges, it is standard practice to confirm clarity of intent. The room felt smaller, not because of confrontation, but because of precision. Thomas read a clause from the earlier draft that required any substantial change to be reviewed by an independent advisor and confirmed in writing without external pressure. He looked up and asked whether such a review had taken place. Lauren answered that Daniel had been fully aware of his decisions and that the updates were meant to simplify matters for everyone. Thomas acknowledged her statement, but noted that no independent confirmation letter appeared in the file. Silence settled across the table, heavy but controlled. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I did not interrupt. I did not accuse. Thomas continued, explaining that without the required confirmation, certain reallocations could be subject to further examination before final distribution. He emphasized that this process was procedural, not personal. Lauren's composure thinned just slightly. She asked what that meant for immediate access to funds. Thomas replied that until all conditions were verified, some accounts would remain temporarily restricted. The word restricted lingered in the air. I felt no triumph, only a steady acknowledgement that Daniel's foresight was unfolding exactly as he had intended. Lauren turned toward me then, her expression searching. She asked quietly whether I had known about the earlier draft. I met her gaze and answered that Daniel had always believed in preparation. That was all I said. The meeting concluded with Thomas outlining next steps, including a formal review of documentation and communication with the financial advisor. As we stood to leave, Lauren gathered her papers with controlled movements. In the hallway, she walked beside me without speaking. Outside, the late morning sun warmed the sidewalk, and traffic moved steadily down Main Street. She finally asked how long I had been in contact with Thomas. I told her long enough to ensure that Daniel's wishes would be respected. Her eyes held mine for a moment, and in that silence I sensed the first crack in her certainty. She had expected grief to cloud my judgment. Instead, it had sharpened it. And for the first time since the funeral, she understood that I was not standing alone at all. In the days that followed the meeting, the town began to settle back into its ordinary rhythm, but nothing about my life felt ordinary. I kept my routines intact on purpose. I watered the small rose bushes Daniel had planted along my front porch. I walked to the corner mailbox each afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock. I attended Sunday service and sat in the same pew I had occupied for years. Grief accompanied me everywhere, quiet and constant, but beneath it was a steadiness that surprised even me. Lauren, however, began to change. She called more frequently, her voice no longer smooth but edged with impatience. She asked whether Thomas had provided updates. She asked how long procedural reviews typically lasted. She asked whether certain accounts could be partially released in the meantime. I answered calmly that legal processes require time and accuracy. I reminded her that clarity protects everyone involved. Each response seemed to unsettle her further. One afternoon she arrived at my house unannounced. I saw her car pull into the driveway through the lace curtains in my living room. I opened the door before she could knock. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited and looked around as if assessing the space. The house was modest but fully paid for, every inch maintained with care. Daniel had repaired the back fence just last spring, measuring each board precisely, determined to make it last another decade. Lauren stood in the center of the room and asked whether I had considered moving closer to her neighborhood. She said it might be easier for everyone if I downsized. The suggestion was framed as kindness, but it carried expectation. I told her that this house held my history and that I was not prepared to leave it. She pressed gently, mentioning market values and buyer interest in our area. I listened without interruption. When she finally paused, I walked to the hallway closet and retrieved a small fireproof lockbox. I placed it on the coffee table between us and opened it deliberately. Inside were copies of the earlier will, my notes from Thomas, and a letter Daniel had written years ago expressing his wishes in his own handwriting. I did not hand her the documents. I simply let her see them. Her eyes moved quickly across the pages, recognition flashing in her expression. She had not known about the letter. Daniel had written it after a minor surgery, saying that life is unpredictable and that transparency prevents confusion. In it, he had stated clearly that certain assets were to remain safeguarded for long-term stability and that no revisions should be made without independent counsel. Lauren's composure faltered. She asked why Daniel had not mentioned that letter to her. I replied that Daniel valued preparation and privacy in equal measure. She then asked whether I intended to challenge the recent changes formally. I answered that I intended to ensure Daniel's original intentions were honored fully and legally. The distinction mattered. She stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her jacket. The air between us felt different now, less performative and more exposed. For the first time, she did not attempt to disguise her frustration. She said that dragging out the process would benefit no one. I told her that rushing it had already caused enough confusion. After she left, I closed the lockbox and returned it to the closet. My hands were steady. I did not feel triumphant. I felt clear. Lauren had believed that isolation would weaken me, that age would slow my thinking, that grief would cloud my judgment. Instead, each attempt to pressure me only reinforced the foundation Daniel had quietly built. The balance of control was shifting, not through raised voices or accusations, but through documentation and patience. And patience, I have learned, is a form of strength that cannot be easily undone. The following week, Thomas informed us that the financial advisor had responded to his formal inquiry and agreed to provide full documentation of every meeting, signature, and electronic authorization related to Daniel's recent changes. The review would take several more days. Lauren did not hide her displeasure this time. She sent a brief message stating that unnecessary scrutiny would only prolong everyone's distress. I read it twice and set my phone down without replying. Silence, when used carefully, can be more unsettling than any argument. On Wednesday afternoon, Thomas called again and asked if I could come by his office. His voice carried the same calm tone, but there was something firmer beneath it. When I arrived, he had several new documents laid out across the conference table. He explained that the timeline of revisions revealed a pattern. The first meeting to discuss increasing the life insurance coverage had been scheduled by Lauren, not Daniel. The second meeting, where beneficiary language was simplified, had occurred on a day when Daniel's medical records indicated he had been heavily fatigued and reliant on guidance. There was no evidence of coercion, Thomas was careful to say, but there was also no independent verification letter, despite the clause in the earlier draft requiring it. He then slid a printed email toward me. It was from Lauren to the advisor, sent late at night, urging that the paperwork be finalized quickly to avoid complications. The phrase she used caught my attention. We need this secured before anything changes. Anything changes. I felt my pulse steady rather than race. Clarity has a cooling effect. Thomas explained that because the confirmation requirement had not been satisfied, and because Daniel's earlier will remained properly executed, the contested modifications could be suspended pending formal review. This meant that a significant portion of the assets Lauren believed were immediately accessible would, instead, be placed under temporary oversight. Thomas also noted that Daniel's original trust structure included a protective clause designating me as co-oversight beneficiary for specific accounts intended for long-term stability. Lauren had overlooked that detail when focusing on liquid transfers. It was not dramatic. It was precise. Thomas asked whether I wished to proceed with invoking the review clause formally. I answered yes without hesitation. Later that afternoon, Lauren called, her voice no longer controlled but strained. She said she had received notice of the temporary suspension and wanted to understand why. I told her that Daniel's original instructions required independent confirmation for substantial revisions and that Thomas was simply honoring those instructions. She insisted Daniel had trusted her completely. I replied that trust and verification are not opposites. They are safeguards. There was a long pause on the line. Then she asked quietly whether I believed she had acted improperly. I chose my words carefully. I said I believed Daniel valued transparency and that transparency protects everyone involved. The next day, she arrived at my house again, this time without the tailored composure. She stood in my living room and said that freezing funds created practical difficulties, that bills and obligations required immediate access. I listened, then walked to the kitchen and returned with copies of the original trust documents. I pointed to the section outlining shared oversight and contingency reserves, funds specifically allocated for household continuity. She had not mentioned those reserves in her earlier summaries. Her eyes scanned the page, and I saw realization settle in. The structure Daniel established did not leave her unsupported. It simply prevented unilateral control. For the first time, she appeared uncertain not about money, but about narrative. The story she had prepared, of a grieving widow navigating chaos alone, no longer fit the facts. I remained composed, my voice even. I told her that honoring Daniel meant following the framework he built, not the one most convenient in the moment. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn Daniel once mowed with quiet pride. Inside, the balance of certainty shifted again, not through confrontation, but through documented truth steadily unfolding. The formal review concluded on a gray Monday morning, nearly 3 weeks after the funeral, when Thomas called both of us back into his office for what he described as a final clarification session. The air outside carried the first hint of early autumn, crisp and measured, and I remember thinking that seasons change whether we are ready or not. Lauren arrived a few minutes after I did, her expression controlled but no longer confident. Thomas began by summarizing the findings in clear, deliberate language. He stated that the increase in life insurance coverage and the rapid consolidation of assets had indeed been initiated at Lauren's request, with Daniel present but without the independent confirmation required by his earlier estate provisions. Because that safeguard had not been properly executed, the contested modifications would not override the standing structure of Daniel's original trust. The room remained quiet as he explained the implications. The liquid accounts recently redirected would revert to the protective trust framework. Oversight of specific reserves would be shared according to the prior designation. Access to larger disbursements would require dual acknowledgement. Nothing dramatic. Nothing punitive. Simply the restoration of the system Daniel had built before any last-minute revisions occurred. Lauren listened without interruption, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly together. When Thomas finished, she asked whether there was any avenue to expedite reconsideration. Thomas responded that the documentation spoke clearly and that Daniel's written instructions left little ambiguity. He then placed a copy of the handwritten letter Daniel had composed years earlier in front of her. In it, Daniel had emphasized the importance of balance, transparency, and shared responsibility, particularly in moments of uncertainty. The letter was not emotional. It was practical. It reflected the young man I had raised, the one who measured twice before cutting a board, who double-checked figures before signing a contract. Lauren's eyes moved slowly across the page. For a moment, I saw something flicker there that was not anger, but realization. The narrative she had prepared, the assumption that proximity granted control, had dissolved into plain language and careful planning. After the meeting ended, we stepped into the hallway together. The building was quiet except for the faint echo of footsteps on polished tile. She turned to me, and asked whether I had orchestrated this outcome from the beginning. I answered honestly. I had not orchestrated anything. I had simply paid attention. I told her that Daniel trusted both of us in different ways, and that trust is honored through adherence to intention, not convenience. She stood very still, then nodded once. There was no apology, but there was acknowledgement. Outside, the sky had begun to clear, thin sunlight breaking through the clouds. I walked toward my car with steady steps, aware that grief still traveled beside me, but no longer overshadowed by uncertainty. Lauren had once leaned close and spoken as though my life had narrowed to a single fragile thread. Now she understood that what she mistook for solitude was structure, what she mistook for weakness was preparation. I did not raise my voice. I did not seek vindication. I simply ensured that my son's careful planning remained intact. And in that quiet restoration, the balance returned exactly where it had always been meant to stand. A week after the review concluded, the town resumed its familiar pace, but the quiet between Lauren and me carried a new weight. She no longer called to press for updates, and she did not arrive unannounced at my door. Instead, she sent brief messages about logistical matters, each word measured. The protective trust had been reinstated fully, and the oversight structure Daniel created now required both our acknowledgments for significant decisions. It was not a punishment. It was balance. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the rooftops of my neighborhood, Lauren asked if she could come by to talk. Her tone was different this time, stripped of urgency. I agreed. When she stepped into my living room, she looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in certainty. She declined the offer of coffee and remained standing for a moment before finally sitting across from me. She said she had reread Daniel's handwritten letter. She admitted that she had believed she was acting in everyone's best interest by consolidating control quickly, that she thought speed equaled stability. I listened without interruption. I told her that stability is not created by control alone. It is created by clarity and shared responsibility. She lowered her gaze and asked whether I thought Daniel would be disappointed. That question lingered in the air longer than any financial figure ever had. I chose my answer carefully. I said that Daniel valued honesty more than perfection. He understood that mistakes can happen, but he also believed in correcting them. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Outside, a lawn mower hummed in the distance, ordinary life continuing as it always does. Lauren then spoke about the night of the funeral, about the strain she felt and the fear of losing everything at once. She did not repeat her words from that day, but she acknowledged that grief can twist perception. I did not remind her of what she had whispered. I did not need to. Some statements echo long enough without repetition. Instead, I told her that grief had not left me isolated. It had reminded me of the foundation Daniel and I built over decades. Preparation is not mistrust. It is love expressed through foresight. She nodded slowly. For the first time since all of this began, there was no calculation in her expression, only understanding mixed with humility. Before she left, she asked whether we could try to move forward with transparency rather than tension. I answered that transparency had always been available. It simply required participation from both sides. After she walked out, I stood at the window and watched her drive away. The sky had turned soft gold, casting long shadows across the quiet street. I felt the ache of missing my son as deeply as ever, but I no longer felt the edge of uncertainty that had followed the funeral. The structure he put in place held firm. The documents, the clauses, the careful planning were not weapons. They were safeguards. Lauren once believed that my world had narrowed beyond recovery. Now she understood that what she mistook for loneliness was resilience shaped over decades. I remained in my home, surrounded by memories measured in pencil marks and repaired fences, steady in the knowledge that honoring Daniel did not require confrontation. It required consistency. And consistency, practiced quietly and firmly, restored a balance that would endure long after the shock of loss had faded. By the time October settled over our town, the air carried that familiar mix of dry leaves and distant wood smoke, and life had found a quieter rhythm. Lauren and I had begun meeting once a week at Thomas Green's office to review trust updates and household expenses together. The conversations were no longer tense, but they were deliberate. Every figure was read aloud. Every adjustment was explained. Transparency was no longer an abstract principle. It was practice. One afternoon, after we finished signing routine paperwork, Lauren lingered behind while Thomas stepped out to retrieve a document. She looked at me and said that she had underestimated me. Her words were not sharp. They were reflective. She admitted that in the days after Daniel passed, fear had driven her to seek certainty in numbers and control. She believed that securing full authority quickly would protect her future. She had not considered that Daniel's version of protection included me. I listened carefully, because acknowledgement matters more than apology. I told her that age often appears fragile from a distance. People see gray hair and assume hesitation. They forget that decades build a different kind of strength, one rooted in experience rather than speed. I explained that I had buried a husband before. I had managed mortgage payments alone. I had raised a son with patience and structure. I did not need control to feel secure. I needed clarity. Lauren's eyes softened in a way I had not seen before. She asked whether I could ever trust her fully again. I answered that trust is rebuilt through repetition, not promises. We would continue showing up, reviewing documents, honoring the system Daniel established. That would be enough. As the weeks passed, small changes emerged. Lauren began consulting me before making household decisions that affected the trust. She shared statements without being asked. She included me in conversations about long-term planning rather than presenting conclusions. The shift was subtle but steady. One Saturday morning, she invited me to breakfast at a small diner Daniel used to enjoy on Maple Avenue. We sat in a booth near the window, sunlight warming the table, and spoke not about assets or clauses, but about Daniel's childhood stories. She laughed when I described how he once tried to build a treehouse without measuring the boards. She said she had never heard that story. For the first time, our shared memories felt like bridges instead of battlegrounds. Later that afternoon, I visited the cemetery alone. The grass had begun to fade from summer green to muted gold. I stood before Daniel's headstone and spoke softly, telling him that the structure he put in place had held firm. I told him that fear had not dismantled it, and neither had grief. The wind moved gently through the trees, and I felt a quiet assurance settle in my chest. The events of the past month had not erased loss. Nothing could do that, but they had clarified something essential. Strength does not require raised voices. Dignity does not demand retaliation. Sometimes the most powerful response is consistency maintained under pressure. When I drove home, the late afternoon light stretched long shadows across my porch. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, aware that I was not alone in the way those words once implied. I carried history, preparation, and resilience with me, and those, I have learned, are companions that do not leave. Winter arrived quietly that year, dusting our town in a thin layer of snow that softened rooftops and muted the usual noise of traffic. On the first Sunday in December, I found myself standing once again in the same white church where everything had shifted months earlier. The poinsettias were arranged along the altar now, bright red against evergreen wreaths, and the organ played a gentle hymn that felt less heavy than the one I remembered from that day. I slid into my usual pew, smoothing my coat across my lap, and allowed the music to settle around me. Lauren entered a few minutes later and chose a seat beside me without hesitation. There was no performance in the gesture, no audience to convince, just quiet acknowledgement. During the service, the pastor spoke about endurance and the kind of faith that survives uncertainty. I listened, not as a woman undone, but as a woman refined. Afterward, as people gathered near the entrance exchanging holiday greetings, Lauren turned to me and asked whether I would join her for dinner that evening. She said she had taken Daniel's old recipe box from the kitchen drawer and wanted to try his favorite pot roast the way he remembered it from childhood. I nodded, feeling something steady and warm beneath the ache that never fully leaves. That evening we stood side by side in her kitchen, measuring ingredients carefully, following instructions written in my own handwriting decades ago. The scent of rosemary and slow-cooked beef filled the house, and for a moment it felt as though Daniel might walk in from the garage, brushing snow from his coat, smiling at the familiar aroma. We set the table without rushing. Before we ate, Lauren looked at me and said that she understood now what Daniel meant when he spoke about structure. She said that what she once mistook for control was actually care built into legal language. I did not remind her of the whisper at the funeral. I did not need to. Some lessons settle deeper when left unspoken. After dinner, I drove home through streets lined with white lights wrapped around bare trees. My house greeted me with the same quiet it always had, but it no longer felt like emptiness. I walked into the living room and paused beside the hallway wall, where pencil marks still tracked Daniel's height year by year. I ran my fingers lightly over the tallest mark and allowed myself a slow breath. Months ago, I had stood in a church feeling the sharp edge of someone else's certainty about my future. Tonight, I stood in my own home, surrounded by memory and proof that preparation outlasts fear. I was not alone. I carried the decades I had lived, the wisdom I had earned, and the foresight my son and I had shared. Grief remained, gentle and constant, but it no longer felt like a verdict. It felt like love with nowhere physical to land. I turned off the lights one by one and looked out the window at the quiet street, snow reflecting the glow of the porch lamp. Balance had returned, not through confrontation, but through steadiness. The system Daniel built still held. The dignity I protected remained intact. And in the stillness of that winter night, I understood something with complete clarity. No whisper could define a life shaped by patience, resilience, and truth.